I was most proud that I went to the all-you-can-eat Chinese buffet there.
Yeah, fix your hair, make sure you look good.
Kansas and only had a bowl of soup and a couple of little things. So I was
That's discipline.
usually
I don't like this wine.
Ready to go.
I don't want it.
All right, let's go ahead and call this meeting to order. This is the Public Health and Safety Committee. I'm Councilperson Richard Harmon. Will the other committee members state your appearances, please?
John Campos.
Sylvia Ortiz, District 3.
It's on. First order of business is the election of a chair of this committee.
I move to nominate Councilman Harmon as chair.
Second.
Thank you. I've been moved and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. The next order of business is the discussion of an ordinance that was introduced by Councilperson Karen Hiller regarding riding of bicycles on sidewalks, which specifically would repeal the existing 5-mile-an-hour speed limit and replace it with a reasonable and prudent under existing conditions test. I had some concerns about this when this came up before the council and asked it to be referred to this committee for discussion. Mary, are you the staff person from legal on this? Were you involved in the drafting of this?
I was.
Of this amendment? Can you kind of give me your thoughts, and then we can have the police and anybody else step in, but your thoughts on the enforceability of the reasonable and prudent standard?
Well, the reasonable and prudent standard is fairly standard throughout the United States when it comes to bicycle riding. In fact, I didn't see any ordinances that had a specific speed limit. The reasonable and prudent standard has been upheld constitutionally as constitutionally enforceable. Most cities do have this reasonable and prudent standard when it comes to riding bicycles on sidewalks. Identical language to the proposed language here. Fort Scott in Kansas also has an ordinance identical to the one that we are considering. And I looked at also cars. That same reasonable and prudent standard applies to vehicles. No person shall drive a vehicle at a speed greater than is reasonable and prudent under the conditions and having regard to the actual hazards. So even though a speed limit may be 30 miles an hour, if it's snowing and rainy and you're going 30 miles an hour and there's an accident, you can be cited for failing to comply with that reasonable and prudent standard. So I think the point was we just wanted to make our bicycle ordinance consistent with our vehicle ordinance and with other cities throughout the United States. That was the rationale.
Does it, am I correct that the pedestrians have the right-of-way on a sidewalk?
Yes.
Okay. Does it help if we, here's what my concern is. If you're on a bicycle going down a sidewalk and there's nobody in sight, reasonable and prudent is fine. I mean, but if you're a pedestrian and a bicycle pushes past you, what's reasonable and prudent in the eyes of the cyclist and what's reasonable and prudent in the eyes of the pedestrian can be two different things.
That's true.
And so it's that ambiguity that has me concerned. Does it? The only thing else I could think of, and this may not be maybe my concern cannot be legislatively addressed, but what I was thinking was could we say that reasonable and prudent under the circumstances, what is reasonable and prudent is made considering, say, the width of the sidewalk and the presence of other pedestrians and other cyclists. Does adding language like that give us a better, more enforceable standard, or are those already implied in the reasonable and prudent?
I think it's implied. It's reasonable and prudent under existing conditions, which I think is broad enough to encompass the width of the sidewalk, the presence of citizens. I think it is now. The police may be able to respond a little bit better than I in terms of how to enforce it.
Okay. Anybody have any other questions of City Attorney's Office?
I don't have at this time, thank you.
Could I call the police to the, not to the stand?
Sure.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you help us in terms of the enforceability? I understand that the difficulty of trying to enforce a 5-mile-an-hour speed limit. But in your experience, enforcing a reasonable and prudent standard, how would that work?
You would have to be able to articulate that to the courts, and you'd have to explain the situation. Reasonable and prudent, someone could be doing 15 miles an hour, 20 miles an hour on a sidewalk, and that's normal and reasonable because there's not a soul on the sidewalk. But if they're flying through with 15 little kids on their bicycles and they get in a wreck, that's where we have to articulate it to the courts that he was riding in an unreasonable and not a prudent manner. I mean, the city center is off the table on this because this is outside the city center. It's not an ordinance that is enforced a 5 mile an hour very frequently, and it's not one that's reasonable and prudent that would be enforced very often, but it would most likely if somebody has an accident and we do the investigation, we show that they were riding unreasonably.
And is that the factual context in which this would arise? There's an accident or somebody's injured?
That would be a good example, yes.
As opposed to an officer driving down the street and seeing a bicyclist going at what appears to be a high rate of speed, there probably wouldn't be a stop and.
No, at 5 miles an hour, how it currently is written, all of our bike officers and most street officers are certified on running radar. And part of that is pacing and judging speeds. And 5 miles an hour, we can articulate you're going faster than. We can say through our training experience, we can see 5 miles an hour. So if we wanted to make stops now, it would be pretty easy because 5 miles an hour on a bike's a crawl. That's not what we're looking at. We're looking at being able to enforce it if somebody actually is riding unreasonably.
Okay. And in your opinion, does it help or hinder or have no effect if we modify the reasonable and prudent standard to specify width of sidewalks, presence of other cyclists, presence of other pedestrians? Does that give an opinion as if the language was modified in that regard?
I'd have to see that language. I mean, at first blush, no.
Okay. All right. Okay. Ms. Ortiz?
Well, and you mentioned sidewalks, what about cars coming out of garages or something like that?
This is part of that. That would be a good example. If somebody's riding at an excessive speed and runs into the back of a car that was slowly backing out because they were.
No, like in our garage, when we come out, you know, the arm goes up and we come out, there's a sidewalk right there, you know, and I don't know, I've almost been hit twice by a bicyclist, just flying down the sidewalk.
Right. That's in the center of the city.
That's at Fifth and Van Buren, is
Right.
that considered?
Yes,
Fifth?
which they shouldn't be riding on the sidewalk in that area.
Okay. Well, that was my original concern, and just to educate the public, because I don't think the public is well educated. We have, with our free bicyclist shop downstairs, or downtown on Kansas Avenue, more people, I'm seeing more homeless people, more people getting bikes, free bikes. They have to go in and learn how to change the tire, maintain them a little bit, and then they get a free bike. And I'm seeing more people traveling on bikes downtown, you know, to do their business and to get to the Mission, to get to the SRS building, to get wherever they need to go. And so just to make sure that we educate them, because I don't think that they know that riding on the sidewalks downtown is illegal.
Some people don't. You're correct.
Our kids do, because we've stopped them, and you know. But
We talk to a lot of people that are riding downtown. Stop and say, "Hey, you need to be out on the street when you're downtown."
and if I may finish, just
Sure.
if we could maybe give out some type of information to them over there at the bicycle shop,
Absolutely.
so that they will know. That's just that's what.
I think they would be a good team member to help educate.
Okay, thank you.
Campos?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In light of the downtown development that we'll be seeing here this spring and then, of course, next year, in that plan, we will be narrowing the streets to a three-way and therefore widening the sidewalks. So it would be somewhat appetizing for someone who is riding a bicycle to be on a now widened sidewalk rather than a narrow street. How do you see us trying to circumvent that issue downtown specifically?
Through education, letting them know what the ordinance is, and also making contacts at stops.
Would in regards to making education materials available to all citizens here in our city, would you also provide those materials in Spanish?
I don't know if it would be the police department that would be providing those education materials, but we could.
No, I have to echo the Madam Deputy, and that is people from various walks of life in our community, specifically the Mexican immigrants that are in our city, do use bicycles for a main source of transportation, mainly because they don't have the resource, and second, they also can't obtain a driver's license. So moving forward with educating people here in our community, I think it would be wise to make sure that not only is the education materials in English, but also in Spanish, so we can have a wide reach in our efforts. If I may, Mr.
Sure.
Chairman. Thank you.
Continue.
My second issue is, how do you see enforcement playing in on the Shunga Trail? I frequent the Shunga Trail, as do Mr. Harmon, and Deputy Mayor lives very close to it. Do you see us enforcing this reasonable language on those trails? Because there's many times that cyclists are going extremely fast, and for someone who used to jog, I don't jog anymore, that can be very frightening, and it can be very dangerous. How would we put some type of TPD presence on those Shunga trails to address this issue?
If it becomes an issue enough that we find it necessary, absolutely. We have to look, I can't tell you exactly what the trails are called. They're not sidewalks.
Right.
So this per se wouldn't fall under that ordinance.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chair, would you know what they're called, the trails?
Trails are just a multi-use pedestrian path.
Pedestrian
Pathway.
pathway?
Well, that was gonna be my next question was, is the Shunga Trail considered a sidewalk?
And I don't believe it is.
No.
No, it's not.
I may be able to answer that.
Sure.
And the answer is no, it is not a sidewalk, because a sidewalk is limited only to pedestrian travel, and the Shunga Trail is open to much more than pedestrian travel, bicycles, skateboards. So it's my opinion it wouldn't apply.
Okay, now, repeat the definition of sidewalk again. Is open only to pedestrian traffic?
Sidewalk is defined in our ordinance, that portion of a street between the curb line and the adjacent property line intended for the use of pedestrians.
So why are we allowing cyclists on sidewalks? If it's
Well-
intended only for pedestrians, I assume you mean walking.
Right, yes, that's correct. So the speed limit is limited on sidewalks. But, well, I see what you're saying. It seems to be inconsistent. We allow bicyclists to ride on sidewalks outside of the center core of the city.
Okay.
And sidewalks are defined as limited only to pedestrians.
Okay. Ms. Ortiz?
Oh, good question.
Oh, I thought you were saying. Any other questions?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Anybody in the audience want to make any comments or anything? Certainly free to. Sir, go ahead. Would you state your name, please?
Andy Fry. I didn't have any specific comments, but I had looked up 2 or 3 different ordinances in other cities and other states after the council meeting. I looked up Minneapolis, Portland, and Tucson. Minneapolis didn't have a speed limit on the sidewalk, but it had a whole bunch, like multiple paragraphs of defining like caveats of specific instances where you should be on the sidewalk or not be on the sidewalk. And so I don't think that's necessarily where people would want to take the ordinance, because it'd just be kind of burdensome to read through all those specifics. And then Minneapolis and Tucson, I don't think either of them allowed riding on the sidewalk at all. But the reason I chose those 3 is they were all considered legal American bicyclists gold standard cities. So they're obviously cities that are concerned with bicyclists and having bicyclists intermingle with traffic and other parts of their city. So I just thought I'd provide that background in addition to what the legal counsel had said about places in Kansas.
If I can ask you a question. You're a cyclist, I assume?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Does the reasonable and prudent standard give you an understanding of what would be considered an acceptable speed versus an unacceptable speed?
Yeah, I mean, when I get on Shunga, I know that I'm not necessarily, I can't speak for all cyclists, but I'll try, I guess. But when you come up to a pedestrian, you shouldn't be flying past them. I mean, there is signs on Shunga that kind of dictate trail etiquette and say to announce yourself, and then, I think it probably mentions something about slowing and then going to their left. But yeah, I make sure and slow down to, maybe not 5 miles an hour, but something where I'm more at a crawl and not pedaling, and so that, and obviously give them plenty of space, because there's instances where people can kind of be alarmed when you come up on them.
Well, the difference between the Shunga Trail and a sidewalk in residential areas, the Shunga Trail is much, much wider
Yeah,
than your
certainly.
typical sidewalk.
Yeah.
I think that's why there's
And-
more of a concern in my mind what happens within the residential areas than
Yeah.
on the Shunga Trail.
And I personally don't ride on sidewalks for the most part, but it's just in situations where, like, you come up, if you're trying to get to Lake Shawnee currently, and there's kind of some limited ways to get there, and if you're coming down 29th Street, once I get up to the Lake Shawnee, I try to hop on those sidewalks or paths, however they're termed, but because that's not a super bike-friendly stretch of road there.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else want to, sir?
Thank you. My name's Nick Exitis, and I live in southwest part of Topeka. I also own Hazel Hill Chocolate downtown, and I'm a bike
Oh,
commuter.
great.
Want to speak in favor of the change in the ordinance. I believe it helps, especially youth, who might need to use the sidewalk to navigate certain parts of the city in a safe and effective way. 5 mile an hour, pretty difficult for someone who is young and probably doesn't have the equipment to accurately judge their speed to comply with that ordinance, where a reasonable and prudent speed, I think, would apply to all users of that space in a way that's effective. So I'd like to encourage you to positively consider this. I think your concerns are well-founded and probably based in personal experience. I can tell you as a recreational cyclist that it's very undesirable for folks moving at high speed to want to be on the sidewalk.
Okay.
And so I don't view it as a large-scale problem. Certainly, there's going to be incidences that are inappropriate, and I think this ordinance and the language probably has the best chance of giving us recourse on folks who are acting in a way that's probably
Okay.
not appropriate. So thank you for taking
Well,
the time.
thank you for your testimony, I appreciate it. Anybody else wish to speak on this matter? Okay, does the committee have any other concerns or issues? I'm going to make a motion then that we recommend passage back to the council as it's drafted. My concerns have been articulated and have been addressed by our staff and by the conferee. So I would recommend that we make no changes except to refer it back to the council with a recommendation to pass. That'd be my motion.
I'll second that for sake of discussion.
Seconded by Councilwoman Ortiz.
Did that alleviate how you felt about the sidewalks, and you're okay with that, the explanation
Yes.
that city attorney gave?
Mm-hmm. I am.
Okay.
Yeah. Any questions? or
No, we're trying to be as proactive as we possibly can to increase the bike culture here in our city, but unfortunately, we will have to wait and be reactive if something does happen. So as we send this back to the council, there is probably a potential for it to come back to this committee to make some nuanced changes, of course, if something happens. So it's just something I want to indicate to the record and those folks that are here, but of course, everyone should bike safely. So.
Absolutely. All right, it's been moved and seconded that we recommend the ordinance back to the council with a recommendation to adopt. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye. I'm sorry.
Can we add language on the central business district? Can we amend that to do that? I mean,
I'm sorry, right now, riding on the sidewalk
it says,
is illegal downtown.
Is illegal?
Yes, it is
Okay,
illegal
so
to
it says no
drive.
person shall ride a bicycle upon a sidewalk within the central business district.
Correct.
Do I know where the central business district is?
It is defined in the ordinance.
It is?
Yes,
Okay, so we're okay with that?
yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you.
No, that's
Mr. Chair.
fine.
I just want to make sure that, because like I said, I don't think a lot of people know how far is the central business district and where we're at downtown, whether it's north, south, east. But that's defined in the ordinance, you said? Okay.
Mr. Colson, do you have any comments before we vote?
No, thank you, sir.
Okay. All right. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Any other business to come before the committee? Seeing no business, I entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Been moved and seconded that we adjourn. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you all for attending. Appreciate everyone's input on this issue.
Sir?
I'm sorry. Painless, yes. All right.